It's been 6 days since vaccinations finally began here in South Korea, with medical workers and physically vulnerable people, including the elderly, at the front of the queue. But much like other countries around the world that have started vaccinations, there have been lingering concerns over whether the jabs are being delivered quickly enough, and even if the rollout is on schedule, whether the doses will work against new variants of the virus. To address these questions today, I'm joined by Dr. Jerome Kim, Director General of the International Vaccine Institute, based here in Seoul. It's lovely to see you again. How are you this morning?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good, and again, wonderful to see you again. And it's been some months since our last interview, and there have been many changes since then, of course. And well, in your recent Nature article published in January, now that many countries have started their vaccination programs, there are new questions regarding the optimization of vaccine regimens, booster shots, vaccine effectiveness and safety. But starting here in South Korea, the country is still seeing 300 to 400 new cases of COVID every day. And there are predictions that a fourth wave might be on the way. And with the government having cut its vaccination target from over 1.3 million to 750,000 for the AstraZeneca shots, do you think the vaccine rollout is going fast enough when most of the population still has months until they can be vaccinated?
Yes, so I think that, and most vaccine experts would agree that the more rapidly South Korea can begin its program of vaccination and continue its program of social distancing, the use of masks and crowd avoidance, the more rapidly the epidemic, the outbreak in Korea will be brought under control. The government can only move as quickly as the vaccines that are available to it. And, unfortunately, for the first 6 months of this year, vaccine supplies will be constrained. Vaccines will be in short supply. As we get to, July, August, September, a significant increase in production and supply will be available. And, I think Korea is in a better position than many countries because, at least for now, the outbreak, although 300 to 400 infections a day seems like a lot, compared to many places in the world, Korea still has the pandemic under control. The vaccine would be great, though, and as quickly as possible.
And while the government's claimed that the country hasn't had the new variants of COVID-19 from Kent, South Africa and Brazil circulating broadly in the country, but just how long can the country fend off the three new major variants?
Well, with the current isolation or quarantine policies, it should be possible to stop the variants in the quarantine facilities, which is, I think, where they've popped up. And that's important. But in the end, economies will be hurt by not opening up again to international trade and travel. So, at some point, the country will have to do that, but that point should be after appropriate vaccination is in place. And the vaccines there is some evidence that would suggest that the vaccines do work against the variants as well.
And it does seem like these variants are coming from all corners of the earth. And well, then what really causes or triggers mutations to turn into these significantly more infectious variants? And do you think we could see strong variants emerging from many countries?
So I think it's probably important to look at where the variants arose. They arose in South Africa, in the UK, which had a large uncontrolled outbreak, in Brazil, which is the second or third largest number of cases, so uncontrolled outbreaks. There are some variants and actually some very interesting things happening with mutations in the United States. Again, relatively large uncontrolled outbreak. You don't see them coming from Asia or Oceania, from Australia and New Zealand. Why? Because the outbreaks are controlled. All viruses generate mutations as a matter of multiplying, it's growing and spreading through a community. But the ability of the Asian countries to control outbreaks and limit spread have really resulted in the generation of fewer mutants, and particularly fewer mutants that are going to be, designed or selected for rapid spread in a population. So distancing and masks, hand hygiene and avoiding crowds, those things, in the absence of a vaccine, will limit the generation of mutants. And the countries that have widespread outbreaks where those measures are not fully enforced or in place are the countries that are having problems with the generation of new mutants that actually are more dangerous in some cases. Not only do they spread better, but they have a higher mortality rate. They kill people more readily.
Well, of course, there was a great amount of hope in that the vaccines would really help keep these numbers down. But now there's a growing amount of concern over whether the vaccines that we have right now are going to work against the new variants. Is there evidence that the current vaccines being administered work just as well against the new types of COVID-19 that we're seeing?
Yeah, so some of the vaccines have better information than others. The vaccines from Novavax and Novavax and Johnson & Johnson actually were tested in areas where the new variants were circulating, and both of them appeared to work against the new variants. Significantly against mild to moderate disease, but really importantly against severe disease, the kind of disease that puts you into the hospital. And that's, when you're a country, you need to limit the impact of COVID-19 on the population. What you want is something that shows an effect on hospitalizations and deaths. And both of these vaccines, Novavax and Johnson & Johnson, do that. We have test tube evidence that the Pfizer-Moderna vaccines actually should work against the variants, but we don't actually have testing in humans that would show that. But that's still a very important demonstration, and a reason why many people think and have confidence that those vaccines, Moderna and Pfizer, should help to contain outbreaks, even in the presence of the mutants, particularly the one from South Africa or Brazil.
And for most countries, 70% has been really the magic number as the threshold of herd immunity. But some scientists are now saying that the new variants will require a higher level of herd immunity than the 70% target that most countries were aiming for. Is that true?
So 70% is a theoretical target. It was generated based on what we believe to be the virus's growth characteristics and rate of spread in a community. Now that we have better information about the vaccines and how effective they are, we may be able to get better estimates on what level of vaccination in the community, what level of herd protection is necessary in order to stop the spread of the virus. So we said 60 to 70% initially. Even before the widespread emergence of the variants, people were saying, well, maybe it needs to be 80%, or you know what, it needs to be as high as possible. Remember that for measles vaccine, it has to be over 90%. So different viruses have different levels of vaccination required to provide protection to the community. Importantly, we haven't done a study yet that actually shows that 70% is the level or that 80% is the level. What we do know is that when vaccination begins, we need to vaccinate as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, and we need to continue to use masks, distancing, and crowd avoidance.
And well, in the US, they're getting ready to roll out the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And while the vaccine doesn't have the same stringent cold chain requirements as the ones developed by Moderna and Pfizer, and it, of course, only requires a single jab, it's proven to be somewhat less effective against milder infections. And people seem to think that perhaps because it's cheaper, that it's also an inferior product. How do you think health authorities should address this kind of hesitancy?
So I think we have to go out there with scientific evidence. I mean, the US FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, the World Health Organization, used 50% as the cutoff for an effective vaccine. Why? Because we know that 50% would probably begin to help us to decrease the number of infections in a community to the level where the epidemic, the outbreak, couldn't be sustained. That's what vaccines are about. I think that the other part, people hear about the efficacy, 50%, 70%, 90 or 95%, and they think, wow, we need to get that vaccine. But in fact, the vaccines all, and this includes AstraZeneca, Pfizer, the Chinese vaccines from Sinopharm and Sinovac, the Russian vaccine, decrease symptomatic infection, which is important, but they all very importantly decrease severe infection. So if the coronavirus disease was not something that put 15% of people in the hospital and killed 1.8% of of the population who gets infected, then it becomes a lot more manageable from a community perspective. It's like taking a tiger and turning it into, well, maybe not a pussycat, but an alley cat. And you're taking something that really has a tremendous impact on countries and populations, and you change it into something that is associated with mild disease, but no hospitalizations and very few or no deaths, and that's what you need.
I really do like the cat analogy there. But, well, in the US, though, there are a growing number of voices that are expressing concern that social disparities are going to worsen as mRNA vaccines, they might be allocated to the richer, better off areas with better health facilities, while what are perceived as inferior vaccines like Johnson & Johnson's will be distributed in areas that are lower income and don't have as many high-quality medical services or facilities. Do you think this is a genuine concern that authorities should consider?
So I think that, in the beginning, and for the United States in particular, because they've had such difficulty using standard control mechanisms like masks and distancing as a means for control, they need to get out there and vaccinate as quickly as possible with whatever vaccine they have in order to control not only the outbreak, but the generation of new mutants. And when everything is under control, we can develop, we can start to utilize booster doses, and we will understand better where the mutations are. So there are a lot of things that the United States is doing now and is trying to catch up on, including, masks, distancing, analyzing what viruses are circulating in the community, which they weren't doing a good job of at first. These are things that the Korean government actually is doing relatively well at this point without the vaccination. And hopefully once now vaccines are increasingly available here, people will use them because they do protect. I think the other interesting thing is, there was a lot of initial concern about the vaccines in the United States. But as more and more people have been vaccinated, now over 40 million, more and more people are saying, well, you know what? I think it would be a good idea. And I think, for the Korean people who want to wait and say, well, let's just wait and see how this goes. I mean, it's important to realize that over 200 million people around the world have received a jab. And so we have a fair amount of information now on safety. We have increasing amounts of evidence from countries around the world that have been more effective in rolling out vaccinations, like Israel, the United Kingdom, the United Arab Emirates, that as you start to vaccinate more and more people, the number of infections starts to go down. And in fact, the number of hospitalizations can go down by 99%. And that's what you want. You don't want people to be in the hospital on ventilators with a high risk of dying.
As you said, a surprisingly high level of vaccine hesitation here in East Asia. And of course, we must all remember the hard work and just the absolute torture, really, that the medical workers are going through at the moment. And we need to minimize this pain as much as possible for them. And well, in the meantime, though, South Korea, of course, is working on its own vaccines. And well, you signed a deal with GI Cell in late January to work on a new vaccine together. So I want to hear, what kind of innovations are you hoping to see? And how will you make vaccines more available for people in developing countries at the back of the queue?
So that's a very important question. And, I think that the front of that, the best answer is Korea and 189 countries around the world, actually now including the United States, have joined COVAX, which is an effort led by the WHO, Gavi, and the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations to distribute vaccine around the world. All the countries that signed up, so 190 or so countries, will get roughly 20% of their supply from COVAX. 90 countries will get it at either no cost or low cost, which is great. And so we'll be able to get the vaccines out. COVAX hopes to have 2 billion doses by the end of 2021, and it looks like they'll probably be on target for that number. So that's an important multilateral solution. Korean companies are working on vaccines like the AstraZeneca vaccine, the Novavax vaccine, those are SK Bioscience, and then as well are working on vaccines of their own. And those vaccines are still in early stage testing and will probably be a part of what we call the second wave, those vaccines that are undergoing efficacy testing. So proof that the vaccine protects against disease and is safe. by the mid to late summer of this year, and with results being reported out hopefully by the end of the year or early in 2022. Very important, because these second wave vaccines could be the ones that have the greatest impact for global health, because they're easily distributed, because they're much more standard in format. They're the kinds of vaccines that we routinely get at doctors' offices.
Well, it's almost been a year since that COVID-19 was declared a global pandemic, and it's certainly taken us by storm since then. But thankfully, scientists like yourself, you're learning more and more about this virus, and hopefully we will make a steady progress out of this tunnel and into full recovery. And unfortunately, we're out of time, so this is where we'll wrap up today. That was Dr. Jerome Kim, Director General of the International Vaccine Institute based here in Seoul. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you for watching.